This is Dan, and I am attempting to do a stream here with a stream about synthesis. It's largely unprepared. It's more of a test than anything, but hopefully nothing will break. The camera is a Logitech C290 or 270. That's perched precariously atop pop filter that is giving the visual angle that we've got now. I'm hoping it doesn't move too much. But anyway, and I hope everyone can hear me. Hopefully I can still hear the audio that'll be coming through. So here it is, a hardware synthesizer, and I'm going to talk a little bit about synthesis, some basic things. So what is synthesis? It is a process by which a number of electronic signals are combined and filtered and modulated and what have you, so that that gives a modified output, and that's then converted into sound. So you might take one or more elements, like so-called oscillators, voltage-controlled oscillators, then pass them through a series of voltage-controlled filters and voltage-controlled amplifiers, and maybe add some other elements along the way, and modify those as you see fit, and then out the other end comes sound of some sort, whether it is tonal, atonal, aesthetically pleasing or not to most ears, to whoever's ears. So that being said, this is a hardware synthesizer. It's the Arturia Mini Brute 2, and while there are a lot of great things about it that are very specific, I am probably going to keep it this demonstration mostly general. So the Arturia Mini Brute here, much like any analog synthesizer, which this is, has a couple of oscillators, voltage-controlled oscillators, 1 and 2, and what that means is that the electrical signal that is fed into the component, the oscillator, determines the output on the other end. The same thing can be said for the voltage-controlled filters and the voltage-controlled amplifiers. So VCO, VCF, and VCA for short. And so really all you're doing is playing around with, well, it's more complicated than this, but you're playing around with an electric signal, and you're modifying the signal in various ways, and then sending it out the other end, and thus sound. So the Arturia Mini Brute. Here we have two oscillators, as indicated before, and then it has a voltage-controlled filter section, which has some bits specific to the Mini Brute 2. I'm not really going to get into those because I just don't think that's too relevant. However, you have that, you have an amplifier section, and you also have a couple of filters in the form of envelopes. Over here you've got an attack and decay envelope, or AD envelope, and then over here you have an ADSR, or attack, decay, sustain, release envelope. And those modulate the sound in various ways. One note that I have to make is that this synthesizer is representative of what's known as a semi-modular synthesizer, which means that this particular one has predetermined electrical paths that can be switched around with knobs and sliders. However, if one wants to extend the signal routing, there is also a 64-point, I believe it's 64-point patch bay that has a number of ins and outs, and you can use cables to route the sound, plugging in the various holes here on the side, which is really advanced for what I would be doing here, but it's there if you want to have fun with it. Then you also have the keyboard section here, which has pitch and mod delay wheels. You also have a sequencer that's built in, and all sorts of switches and things to change various parameters. Now, a lot of synthesizers may have different configurations, like this one again is semi-modular. You might have a synthesizer that is completely pre-wired or predetermined, if you will, with some switches and things to alter the pathways. Then you have the semi-modulars, and then you have the completely modular synthesizers, in which you buy individual parts. You buy your own amplifier, you buy your own VCA, you buy your VCF, you buy your VCOs, and any number of them in any configuration, and any other parts, any other modules that you want to include in your modular synthesizer, wired up however you see fit. That takes a lot of planning. So I figured I like the idea of having a modular synthesizer. However, that would be incredibly overwhelming, which is why instead I decided to go semi-modular. As I know what I'm seeing here, I know what to expect as far as the fundamental routing internally to the keyboard, and then I have the option to add if I wanted to. So that was a huge preface. So why don't we get to the sound? So as stated, there are two oscillators. The first one has 4 waveforms. What's a waveform? Well, a waveform is just a sound wave, a very basic, simple sound wave that is repeated so many times a second. And you can increase the volume or the gain of these waveforms in the first oscillator to make them audible. Well, and you can mix and match as you see fit. So here we have a sawtooth wave. Here's an example of a sawtooth waveform rather. Okay, so that's a sawtooth. And then we also have a square waveform. We have also, I believe that's a triangle wave. And then we have a noise. Okay, and then we have oscillator 2, which has a couple of settings here for the waveform. You can only select one at a time. So here's the waveform. Oops, and each oscillator has its own little tuning knob. So this one is, I believe, a sine wave. This one is a square. Oh, I think I had it backwards. This one is a triangle. Excuse me, a sawtooth. And this one is square. And it also has some extra parameters here for how it routes to other parts of the synthesizer. Right now it's just, and the frequency range that it can access. So this one is more or less between a couple of octaves. Well, an octave down and an octave and a half up. Either way. So what do we do when we want to use both? Well, we can keep this up actually and select the waveform we want. Let's say we want to go with a square. So it's kind of cool sounding. And then let's add another square. So as you can hear, both the tunings are a little bit out of phase of each other, depending on where I set each of the frequency settings for the VCOs. So it kind of has this phaser-like effect. In fact, that's what's happening. These signals are just ever so slightly out of phase. And that's why you hear the sound kind of doing that the way it does. What I tend to like to do to make the sound a bit fatter, for lack of a better word, is to set the second oscillator down by an octave. Oops. There we go. And so if you want to create any sort of more epic sounding tones, or if you want to create like a bass, you can set the sound that way. The first oscillator here also has a whole bunch of different parameters for modulating the frequency. I'll turn this down. have a couple other things. Actually, this is a portamento, I believe. And that only affects oscillator 1. But you also have various other parameters here that are specifically routed to each of these waveforms. I'm not really going to get into those because those are specific to this keyboard. But suffice to say that your synthesizer may have other options that will allow different things on different waveforms. But you can combine those sounds. Pulse width modulation, that's typically used with a square. Then you've got what is here. I can't read because my eyes are failing me. Let's bring up this triangle. And we've got this parameter that is specific to the Mini Brute 2, which is the metallizer. And we can adjust the amount that we add to that. So that's pretty neat. And then we have another effect here. That is useful with the sawtooth wave. I keep on saying triangle. So now what do all three of these sound like all together on the first oscillator? I mean, they're all together, kind of sounds muddy, but it's there. And then the noise. And then we'll play around with some of these parameters. Let's also bring in oscillator 2. Okay, so let's play around with the oscillators a bit, or we did. Now, I guess we'll move next to the frequency section. So, frequency filter section, excuse me. So the filter section here, the voltage controlled filter, VCF, is a module, if you will, that allows for different, I'm trying to think of this in a non-technical way. It allows for sound to be attenuated. That's a pretty big word. So it limits or allows the amount of sound below or above or in between or outside of a certain threshold. That was a lot of words. So maybe it's best to demonstrate. So I will leave it like that. And so this controls this orange knob here. If you can see it, controls the amount of the frequency that we want to, say, allow through. And this knob over here is basically like a volume, if you will, for the frequency band or the specific frequency point that is targeted by this knob. So let's say, oh yes, and before I forget, there are different types of frequency filters. So we've got this, I think, is the default for me on low pass filter. You've also got high pass, low pass filter allows any frequencies below the current setting of the knob, the frequency knob, to pass through. High pass filter, conversely, allows any high frequencies above the knob through. And then you have a notch filter, which essentially ducks the frequency range at the setting of the knob. And I believe there's also band pass, which is the opposite of notch, which only allows that small set of frequencies through. And so right now we have it on the low pass filter setting, the mode, also known as LPF. And so the second knob here is the resonance, the volume, if you will. That's not terribly accurate, but that's the best analogy I can think of. So let's say we have our frequency setting set to max. Now listen to what happens here when I first increase the resonance to max and then adjust the frequency down. Did you hear the difference between when I had the resonance all the way down versus all the way up? Let's try it again with the resonance all the way down. So it was a lot more pointed in terms of the frequency that was being swept through with the resonance all the way up. Whereas with the resonance all the way down, that particular frequency sweeping through was not as exaggerated. So there you have that. And then we have, let's move on to the ADSR. This one's a little bit more complex, but essentially what this deals with is this particular ADSR by default deals with the frequency domain. And this AD, to skip ahead a bit, deals with the time domain by default on the synthesizer. And what that means, what that does for either of these is to adjust the amount of attenuation. It gives the time of adjustment of that value to the next value. So why don't I try to show it this way? So attack is the amount of time that it takes for the sound to get to the target frequency or volume. And the next one, delay, is the amount of time it takes for the sound to get to a nominal volume, which would be next in this case sustain. And so this is the volume at which the sound is a constant as long as the note is still on. And release is the amount of time that the sound still sounds, essentially, after the note is released from the keyboard. Well, in this case, once again, it's frequency that's affected as opposed to the volume, whereas this would have just the time of the volume and the envelope. I could be explaining that a lot better. This is not something I do every day, but just to demonstrate here, typical arrangement might be something like what I had before, actually, and maybe a little bit of release. So here we have that, and I will adjust the parameters here for the envelope a bit. Okay, so, and then bring that down a bit. You can already hear a difference there. Sustained frequency after that really long attack, and the slightly shorter delay time to this sort of consistent frequency setting we have now. And so if I were to mid to 3/4. There's the same curve as that frequency drops and drops and drops after the initial rise up. And there's a bit of delay, but it's still there. Alright, so next we have, reset that back. Next we have the attack and delay, and these primarily affect the amplitude as opposed to the frequency, the amplitude or the volume, if you will, of the sound. So, just pressing the key in the default state, you can hear a very quick attack and a very quick release. Or, there is absolutely no delay, no pun intended, when you release your finger from the key. Release the key, excuse me. And so let's adjust that. Let's increase the attack a bit, about halfway, and let's leave it at that for now, just to show you the attack. It's not as sharp, that initial note. Let's push it even further. So give a really long attack. So you can see it gradually comes in the higher the attack setting. So let's knock that down a bit, and let's increase the delay. Let's say about the same level, like we're at half and half. So you can see there's a bit of a, once again, no pun intended, delay as soon as I take my finger off the key. And let's bump up delay even further. So it fades out gradually now. Now if I push the attack to the lowest setting, so it's a lot sharper. It sounds like a kind of a soft bass sound. Okay, and there you have that. Alrighty, so now we have the sequencer. I'll move on to that. And let's see here. So, actually, before I get to the sequencer, it's a bit more complicated. Let me go to the low frequency oscillators, or LFOs. Those can be thought of as just another type of voltage control oscillator, or VCO, except that the frequency is so low that the LFO output is inaudible. So what LFOs are used for primarily is to adjust, send the output of the LFO to another parameter, so that that parameter in turn can be modulated. So as you can see, yes you can, I think, you can see these two modules here with the flashing lights, and those flashing lights indicate the LFO rate, or the rate at which the oscillator oscillates between 2 points. Well, I essentially just described an oscillator in general, but that applies to the LFOs, which are extremely low oscillating, and then you have the VCOs, which are in the audible frequency range. So LFOs generally, I think you could probably think of as below 20 hertz, 20 cycles a second, whereas the range of human hearing, of course, is roughly 20 to 20,000 hertz. Someone correct me in the comments if there are comments. But yeah, so let's take LFO 1 and let's do some routing. So primarily LFO 1 on this keyboard is routed to, of course, the modulation wheel, and I believe either the FM parameter and or the PWM, pulse width modulation parameter. And so right now it's on its lowest setting in terms of the rate, and then there's also a curve setting, or a waveform setting, if you will, much like the oscillator setting, where you can select things like sine wave, sawtooth, that sort of thing. I'm just going to leave it at its default setting for now, but just to demonstrate the modulation wheel, right now at its current setting, very slowly increasing and decreasing up in pitch. Okay, I'm getting a little tired of that. Let me speed that up a bit. I'm going to speed that up really, really high. Okay, so I'm actually going to turn these down. Over here. So we've got the modulation wheel hooked into the LFO. We also have the PWM hooked in. So I'm going to mute all these other waveforms on oscillator 1 and keep the square going. And change the LFO 1. So you can clearly see that by default LFO 1 is linked to PWM. Also, oops. I stand corrected, it's linked to PWM at the very least. The idea being that you can use the LFO to modulate other various predetermined signal paths, and of course by extension using the patch panel you can modify other things. So the idea is that the LFO can modulate other parameters even though itself does not really make, the LFO itself does not make a sound. Alright, and you have two of those. Those can be routed any which way using the patch area here. And, oh yes, so the sequencer. The sequencer is a fun little tool that you can use to, well, create a sequence of notes. One thing to note about this particular synthesizer and most analog synthesizers, as far as I'm aware, again, please feel free to comment on that, that this is a monophonic synth. What that means is that it is only possible, outside of doing a little bit of mucking around, but it is only possible to play one note at a time. Oop. It's also possible to play have no note sound if you don't have a waveform at its volume here. So, yes. So as I'm pressing one note here, I will press the G below, and as you can hear, while I have two fingers on two keys, the G note overtakes the A note. And as soon as I take my finger off the G, the A comes back. And so while there are ways to make it polyphonic as opposed to monophonic, that is outside the scope of this video. Apologies for the camera angle. I wish I had a better setup for this. But anyway, so on the sequencer, this is the area where the sequencer is located, and you have, your play button, stop, record, and some other handy features brought about by the shift button over here, which can also be used to change some other parameters on that are activated by the keyboard. Yes, so you have the option to, oh yes, before I forget, you can also set it to sequencer and arpeggiator, but I'm losing track of myself. Sequencer, you can select any variety of notes to include in a sequence. That came out wrong. You can play a bunch of notes to include in a sequence, so I'll just play some simple rhythm here, or simple pattern. In a way that's called step sequencing, where it doesn't matter rhythmically how you play the notes, as long as the recording is enabled, you'll be able to record those notes. And so now that we've put those notes in, we can play back the sequence and adjust the speed with this knob, the tempo rather. also adjust which sequence you want to play, and with this knob. And with this knob, you can select the resolution of the sequence. So like what note length value you want the notes to be in the sequence. So let's say like 1/8, 1/16, 1/32. Not sure if it goes that far off the top of my head, but those features are there. And we've got so many other in-depth features. You also have an arpeggiator, which uses the same buttons in the sequencer area, and you just hold down a few keys. Oh, it would be handy to actually turn the arpeggiator on. So you turn the arpeggiator on, and depending on how many notes you hold down, it will play those notes in that number of notes. And so all of that can be thrown together, and all those concepts that I sort of breezed through, and you can do some really wonderful, awesome things, and more, well, some really awesome things combining those and even more specific details of the synth. And yeah, it's just a really, for lack of a better word, magical machine. And there's so much to do and explore just in and of itself, without having added any cables. So why don't we make a sound? If you like to, let's see. Why don't we do some sort of a string or pad-like sound? When I think of that, I think of a really long, or shall we say, high attack in terms of the value, and I think of a really high delay. And I could go with something like a fifth in terms of the notes, so we can use 2 oscillators, so we can have a root note and tune the second note roughly to a fifth. So why don't we do that now? Of course, I'd want to increase the volume on one of the waveforms. Okay, that's a fifth. And let's try to find a waveform that is more suitable here. Also something to be said where if the note is still playing, the attack does not take effect for each new note. So you have to actually lift your finger up off the note, and even then, it'll take over from the last point where the signal was starting to drop down. So it doesn't quite work in the same way as one might expect with a digital synthesizer that might have its parameters adjusted to be able to re-trigger for... Actually, I take that back. Let's see what happens here. Oh, excuse me. Nope. Alright, so there is a bit of a trick probably where I can have each note regardless of how closely or far apart, how closely or far spaced they are, to re-trigger that long attack. But suffice to say, for now, if I space these notes out long enough, I can get a sense of kind of a soothing sound Other synthesizers might have various effects to make the sound wider, like chorus or phaser, reverb, delay. No, not quite like that delay in the envelopes here, but like a repeating echo effect, kind of. Unfortunately for demonstration here, I don't have those effects, so I don't have the benefit of making it sound really pleasantly ambient. But what I've got here I kind of like. And it might work in some circumstances, so that's pretty cool. Now, let's think drums. So one element of a drum kit is the bass kick. So what does a bass kick sound like? It typically has a very, well, as the name would imply, bassy component to it. So it'd be very rumbly in the low frequency area, and there might be a tone that kind of slides down very quickly, like toom, toom. And so that brings to mind a square waveform. And let's put in oscillator 2. Let's give it some beef over there. I said beef. And let's see how that sounds initially without making any other adjustments. Okay, so we have our tone. And now what we want to do is to modulate the pitch of one of the oscillators. And we also want to probably use a very low frequency on the, or very low pitch on the keys. Cool. Alright, let's make some adjustments here to the frequency ADSR envelope. And let's adjust that. That needs to be cut short somehow. That almost sounds like a really cool bass, actually. Kind of like a very soft Amiga type. Anywho. So I take that back. Sometimes part of the fun of exploring is to kind of accidentally come upon some settings and create something else that you haven't thought of. So this is probably a terrible example, but if I had to increase the volume a bit, that might be somewhat of a bass kick. Not quite the one that I had in mind, but that could definitely be something you could record and maybe tweak a bit to get more of a bass kick-like sound out of it. Kind of like a garage type kick. Alright, now I guess let's try some kind of a lead tone, which is pretty easy to do with a very low attack setting. And also try to revert these settings here to something that is more audible. There we go. Oh yes. Ooh. Just the FM on the oscillator 1. That could be something like electric guitar sound, for example, or something that has some presence to it. And if I wanted to pull in the second oscillator, it's a little bit more shrill, but it's something that, again, you have a sound that has more presence. So just some ideas to fumble around with as I'm putting together these elements of what might be considered kind of like a rock band kind of setup. So many different things, so many different possibilities. I'm probably rambling, but I hope you enjoyed some of what you saw here. Any questions or comments, I'll try to answer them. But yeah, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will probably try this again next week. Hopefully a little better prepared next time. All right.